Okay, all right. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Polis for hosting this conversation that we're about to have on shared data for shared micromobility. We'll be running through a number of topics that relate to the ways in which micromobility, but mobility more generally, can contribute useful data for cities to undertake and achieve the objectives they've set for themselves. Before we start, I'd like to run through a few logistical details. If we go to this slide. In the discussion, you have a chat that is available to you on the right-hand side. You can go into there and check our session tab, and there you can ask your questions and engage with others on points that they've made there. The chat logs will be saved and will be shared after the conference, because there's a lot of value in those discussions. But please do pay attention to the discussion that's going on stage. That's where the main value for the session is. To maximize the screen, you can hide the chat or double click on the presentation or the speaker. Now, to view who's attending the session, you can go to the People tab on the upper right-hand side and see in this session who is there. And after the session, please do try the networking function or visit the exhibition area. It is a valuable part of the POLIS conference, even in this virtual environment. All right, Laura, if we can have the next slide. I'd like to thank Laura from Polis for supporting this session in the background. You can see that we have 5 speakers today, 5 speakers that will be talking around this topic, and each will present a relatively short presentation. We'll have a few clarifying questions, and then we will have a panel discussion following that, ending right at 1 o'clock. My name is Philippe Crist. I'm the advisor for innovation and foresight at the International Transport Forum at the OECD, and a good chunk of what I do now, especially as it relates to new mobility and new mobility services, relates to data and the data ecosystem, the regulation of the data ecosystem, and data governance issues, because these are really fundamental to the ways in which new mobility can create more value for cities and more value for people. Now, the late Susan Lee Starr, she was a groundbreaking sociologist of technology, famously called us to engage more in the study of boring things. Now, what did she mean by boring things? What she meant was lists of numbers, technical specifications, hidden mechanisms that give rise to the very real and very material impacts in our world, and more to the point here, within our cities. Now, there isn't a single thing that we're discussing around mobility in our cities that isn't the emergent tip of a massive iceberg, if you will, of technical specifications, of standards, of reams and reams, or more to the point, of petabytes and petabytes of data. So we're here to discuss something that the non-data geeks amongst us view as boring as they are essential to the good functioning of our cities. And specifically, we'll be discussing how shared mobility data can inform and shape policy and help to regulate new mobility services in our cities. Change, as you all know, is underway in our cities, both with the arrival of many new mobility services, many of them shared, but also with a shift in data collection away from the public sector to the private sector. Cities are flooded with streams of digital data, but will drinking directly from these fire hoses quench cities' thirst for better and more sustainable outcomes? Or will they just end up essentially where they were before, just soaked now? Polis has convened this panel of 5 well-placed experts to discuss this topic, and you'll notice that there is not one single city representative amongst them. So I will be asking you, the audience, and I'll be depending on you, the audience, to bring that city perspective to our screens and to this discussion, to question, to challenge, and build on what our panelists have to say. All I ask is that you help us answer the question that is most on our minds around this topic. What matters to cities in all of this, and what can cities do to make sure that data sharing from shared mobility helps you achieve your objectives? To do that, we're going to open up with a presentation by Aman Chitkara. I'll ask Aman to come on the stage. Aman is the leading expert at the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, and he leads their work on data sharing. Now, the WBCSD's focus has been around on identifying how and where common value can be created around the sharing of data amongst different actors. And he'll be describing the WBCSD's recommendations for data sharing policies that support sustainable outcomes on an ongoing set of projects that he has been helping to lead. So Aman, with that, I'll ask you to share your screen, and I look forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you for joining in. And thank you, Police, for giving the opportunity to discuss this extremely boring topic on data and data sharing. As Philippe mentioned, we at WBCSD convene business leaders for a sustainable future. We are convening about 200 global companies to effect systems transformation to ensure that 9 billion people are living well and within planetary boundaries by 2050. Data sharing is something that we realize has a transformative effect in terms of realizing a sustainable mobility future for all of us. Of course, hundreds of billions of dollars are at stake as increasingly our transportation systems become more digitized. But additionally, the sustainable future of our cities is also at stake. Many cities around the world are seeing problems around increased congestion, increased emissions, particulate pollution, as well as other safety-related issues. Data can be harnessed to effect change on multiple dimensions, and we believe that solutions that are emerging right now, whether it's around mobility services, new mobility solutions, intelligent mobility, can all play a part in bringing about this transformation. But of course, there are several barriers to data sharing. Privacy and ethics come foremost to our attention, whether it's privacy of individuals or privacy of organizations and entities who may be averse to sharing their data, primarily because of disclosing information that can lead to further risk and liability related issues. Interoperability, whether it's around how data is being standardized and collected. Cybersecurity, of course, is another issue, as has been apparent through multiple breaches of databases across the world. And of course, competition, both real and perceived. Many organizations see data that they have as an asset, as a source for differentiation, and sharing that data or losing access to their customer data can mean that other organizations, other entities can undercut the competitive edge that these organizations have been holding for a very long time. That said, earlier this year, we at WBCSD started talking about principles for data sharing that can help overcome some of these barriers that I just talked about. Core to these principles are 4 themes: value, vision, trust, and future-proofing. When I talk about value, what I'm talking about is creating shared value between public and private sector stakeholders so that we can ensure that all the parties who are sharing their data can benefit and can help overcome the barriers to sharing data. Policymakers, in this case, can articulate a value exchange framework, whether it's in terms of some sort of a tax or a subsidy, or whether it's in terms of some sort of a cost-sharing structure or shared resources to essentially overcome some of the initial hurdles as it relates to collecting data or aggregating and sharing data. When I talk about vision, what I'm really trying to articulate here is the need to use data for a specific policy outcome. Data by itself is useless, but when it can be pushed and used for a given use, that can be commonly shared between multiple different stakeholders, again, governments, businesses, citizens, and other civil society organizations. That's when data and technology can really be harnessed for the purposes that we're trying to achieve. Embedded within vision is the need for purpose specificity and data minimization. that when data is being collected, we use it for the purposes that we're intending it to. And data minimization essentially talks about collecting the minimum amount of data to fulfill that purpose. The third point that I want to talk about is trust. As we know, with any other new technology or platform, trust is extremely important for widespread adoption, as well as future sustainability of that particular technology. Once breached, it's really hard to kind of get back. And that's where privacy and ethics and ensuring that both of these ideas are fundamentally embodied within the design of data sharing frameworks becomes increasingly important. Future-proofing, the technology is changing extremely fast. Business models are evolving, so ensuring that whatever new models are being proposed, whatever new means are being proposed, whatever new policies are being proposed can adhere to or can adapt to these evolving dimensions is also another principle that we've identified. That said, what became pretty clear to us through this exercise is that policymakers need to play a very strong role in ensuring that we can harness the potential of data sharing while minimizing these negative externalities, so to speak. The path towards increasing digitalization and data sharing is pretty clear at this point in time as new value streams emerge by combining new sources of data. The first part that I'm articulating here, the part that ideally we should be following, is one where policymakers, businesses, and other organizations can collaboratively work on creating some sort of harmonized policymaking processes that guide the development of data sharing ecosystems. This should lead us towards our vision for sustainable mobility, safe, clean, accessible, efficient mobility. It also helps us lead towards a competitive data economy in the sense that there are organizations of all sizes and capacities who can participate in the market. And of course, the third fundamental idea here is that we can create data systems that use data ethically, that data is ensuring that privacy of individuals and corporations and other entities is not being compromised, and existing biases, whether it relates to race, gender, age, etc., are not being further accentuated. Now, status quo, or the lack of any sort of harmonized policymaking approach, or where policymaking is essentially lagging behind market and technology development, may lead to outcomes that we want to avoid. Siloed approaches, as we've seen in the cases of mobility as a service, can increase congestion, can increase emissions, can undercut public transit ridership. Those are not the outcomes that we're looking for. We do not want to monopolize data economies further or widen the data divide between the haves and not haves. And of course, over the last few years, we've seen how biases in AI technologies and other algorithms can creep in, whether it's around race or gender or age. And we want to avoid all of those. That said, earlier this year, again, we took on an initiative in collaboration with the Sum for All Consortium, which is hosted at the World Bank, and with the International Road Federation to articulate a policy framework for data sharing. What you're seeing right now are the 5 fundamental layers of policymaking that we've identified. These are essentially areas where we feel that policymakers can have a role to play in the evolution of an effective, robust data sharing ecosystem. All of these layers are interconnected, and we feel that the lower layer essentially affects decision-making on a subsequent layer. So the bottom layer essentially is talking about data collection and merging, how we collect data from various different sources, how do we ensure privacy and data protection, and how do we merge and aggregate that data to realize the value that we're looking for. Again, we feel that policymakers can have a significant role in ensuring the values that we're looking for are met at this step. Data standards is another place where we feel that policymakers have a role, as we've seen again in the evolution of mobility data specification, where the city of LA took a lead in terms of standard development, as well as encouraging adoption by other cities. There are other cases as well where policymakers may want to play a role in standard development as well as standard adoption to get us towards a more harmonized data sharing ecosystem. The third layer is around communications infrastructure. Here we talk about data storage and management, whether we need a centralized data repository or whether it needs to be disaggregated. And also talking about financing infrastructure investment. Again, this requires massive investment in terms of servers, in terms of all sorts of other communications infrastructure. And of course, there's also the energy that is being used to run these servers. So thinking about all of these different facets and how it's going to be financed and powered is somewhere another area where we see policymakers can play a role. Governance and accountability talks about the structure of the governing body of a data sharing collaborative, as well as thinking about the control over data. It also talks about the rules for various different parties who are participating in a data sharing collaborative. What are the rules for misuse, or what are the liabilities that an entity might need to incur in case there is any violation of the set rules. And then finally, we talk about user analysis. Here, we're talking about ensuring that the original vision for a data sharing collaborative is being adhered to, that we are indeed using and processing data in an ethical way, that access to data for parties who are licensed and allowed to access that data is happening in a way that conforms to the original vision. This is, again, an early framework. We are in the process of developing this paper. At this point in time, we have about 30 policy suggestions that we've started to articulate. We would be very keen on hearing your perspectives as the policy framework continues to evolve. And again, we don't think that this is a static framework. These are static suggestions. A lot of what's emerging in data sharing right now is the need to test and iterate. And we feel that as multiple cities take on new pilots and projects and new initiatives, there is room for improvement to this policy framework and what policymakers might be able to do to ensure that data sharing is indeed serving sustainable mobility goals. So come participate and support us. So
excellent. Thank you, Aman. That's a very comprehensive framework, and I like the way that you've structured that, both in the past work and in the ongoing work. I do have a question, and it picks up on a point that was made by Helmut Augustin from Vienna, and that is that one of perhaps the most relevant barrier to data sharing is regulatory avoidance or regulation avoidance. So I guess my question to you is, you've talked a lot about creating common value by sharing data, but at some point we need to talk about hierarchies of value. And in what context does that make sense? Does individual value matter as much as collective value? Does commercial value matter more than individual value? And in different contexts, how do we actually arbitrate between these types of values? Or do you view them all as equal across the board? That's certainly something that we're interested to hear from I think our cities who have to deal with arbitration all the time.
So a few thoughts on that. First, the policy framework that we're articulating here is primarily dealing with areas or use cases where there is a critical need for public intervention. So we're not necessarily talking about business-to-business data sharing, where governments may have a lesser role to play because there's lesser public good to be had. We're talking about data sharing when it comes to primarily business to government, or in some cases, business to customer type data sharing use cases. And I understand, of course, that there are certain regulatory avoidance issues, and that's where arriving at a common vision, whether it's articulated in the data strategy of a given government, a sump that might be articulated by a given city, or a broader transportation strategy that is articulated at the national or international level comes into play. I think those should be the starting points for these discussions around articulating a common vision for what we're really trying to achieve, whether it's data competitiveness, whether we're trying to move towards a certain type of transportation system. Those types of existing policies or strategies take precedence in terms of dictating what sorts of values we might want to adopt. The last thing that I want to talk about is the difference in terms of geographies. North American geographies are very different, or the political system in North American geographies is very different from the way things happen in Europe, the way things happen in Asia. So there is also a need to adopt this policy framework in the local context, and that's again where encouraging different stakeholders to come on the table and essentially think about what the common ground might be becomes essential.
Yeah, I think it is use case specific, and part of the difficulty for cities is actually trying to navigate what conditions to put in specific use cases. There's a lively discussion that's developing in the chat, but we do have 4 other speakers. So we're going to switch over, and I'm going to welcome Thibault Castagne on stage. Thibault is the one of the co-founders of Vianova and the CEO of Vianova. Vianova is a data platform that helps cities better integrate and manage shared, connected, electric, and potentially in the future, autonomous transport solutions. And that is already helping several cities implement data sharing frameworks built on the MobilityData specification, among others. Vianova is a third-party platform that enables cities to access value, as Aman said, from their data. So Thibault, I'm going to ask you to share your screen, and we'll go ahead for an 8-minute presentation from you, and then we'll have a few questions as well.
Thank you, Philippe. Let me share my screen.
Excellent. Please feel free to ask the questions and continue the chat or the discussion in the chat. All right, Thibault, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you, Karen, for letting me having this presentation today about Vianova and about specifically actually use cases that we developed with cities. And I think that's the most important is what, data sharing for what. So is setting up basically data agreements for which purpose. And I would like to focus specifically on that during that presentation. As a nutshell, Vianova is a technology mobility startup working with cities in setting up data platform to manage future mobility on city streets. So at an agenda, I would like to go through the learnings for the last 18 months that we gathered through operators and city authorities collaboration in implementing micromobility management system. First, doing a first introduction about Vianova, who we are and what we do, looking at the changing landscape and good practices for data sharing, and finalize the presentation with different use cases. So it came as like a huge interest basically from cities to actually access data in order to better integrate future mobility on the city streets. So all this shared mobility has challenged public order, safety, and city transit, and cities need to actually better integrate them together, as well as better integrate them to the urban realm. So they need data and efficient tools to actually supervise a range of mobility systems on the city streets. As Vianova, so we actually build a mobility platform for cities, actually build with cities in partnership with them by making sure that we were fulfilling actually their use cases towards what they wanted to achieve as micromobility management. To help them actually enable efficient shared public space and promoting actually a safer multimodal transport system. So what we provide is basically a mobility management web dashboard, as you can see, that enable actually bilateral data sharing between mobility operators and transport authorities. On one hand, actually shared mobility providers would share what we call vehicle telemetry to the city. And on the other hand, the city would actually share policy information to the shared mobility. Through this exchange of information, we can actually accomplish a better and successful micromobility management and integration to the public space. And I will give you a few examples about that. To come back on what actually I'm going to share with you, so this actually was our work for the last 18 months. So we've been involved actually co-leading with city authorities a dozen of mobility data projects with European cities from different size, setting up actually mobility management system with them, and advising cities generally on data analysis and new mobility policy, and working with them basically through the fulfillment of their use cases. So what we actually learned is that 2020 was much better than 2019 and 2018 for different reasons. First of all, actually working on the ground for the last 18 months showed us that cities have much more maturity, both actually in terms of data, understanding the standard, understanding the why actually they need to require data from operators, and second, of policies. So we see basically policies being set up, we see regulatory framework in different cities being more mature, and enabling basically authorities to have more, let's say, management power than they used to do, where laissez-faire was generally the widespread in Europe a couple of years ago. So cities are also becoming the main client with PPP, tenders, and permits. So that actually changed the relationship between operators and cities, when actually cities are the main client of operators. So third, operators are engaging also in very constructive ways with cities. So this, we also see that changing a lot in 2020 in the last few years, maybe on the fact that cities are becoming the main client, that operators are much more engaged in terms of data sharing and policies than they used to be. And cities are paying attention to each other. It means that they're sharing good ideas and how to actually to improve themselves. Data quality is improving, which is very important. And nearly like universal use basically of international formats, MDS and Gbfs, which is generally very good for the industry in terms of value creation. And data privacy and understanding of GDPR is improving. So both actually at the operator level, but also city authorities. GDPR compliance is improving, and the understanding also on how to set up this data agreement is improving a lot as well. So in terms of guidelines of shared mobility management, we believe that cities should start develop a vision for shared micromobility as part of the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, creating a standard for their vision of why they need actually shared mobility and how they need it. They need to set a regulatory framework that fits into that strategic vision. They need to leave enough flexibility to adapt and add policies on this regulatory framework. Generally, that's every year or every 2 years, so that makes sure that you have enough basically flexibility to add basically new policies coming in as you measure results and you want to add new policy or amend them. Add data requirements. Data quality, MDS data format are very important as part of the data requirement to ask to operators, and include safety and sustainability equity criteria in order for operators to fulfill the city objectives. You need to set clearly the purpose of data collection and communicate it well to operators. So why do you actually need the data, for which reason, and to develop what use case? Very important for GDPR compliance, but also very important in terms of collaboration with mobility operators. And then it's about engaging in a virtuous circle. So that means what? That means actually building the policy. That means measuring, so controlling and analyzing basically the success of these policies, then doing an audit, and then recrafting the policy or amending it or adding some more basically to fulfill the city objectives. Now I will basically present you some use case. So we'd like to think that basically, again, like cities needs to start with the purpose of why do they actually need the data for what, and it's all about the use case on what to develop. And I think giving that transparency also to mobility operators is generally like very important, and having basically a well-run micro-mobility system in the city. So, giving some examples, an example of Zurich, where there was a first question about how to actually enable multimodal journey through mobility hub, physical mobility hub, and improving public transport service. So this is actually what we did. We actually helped the city of Zurich and WBCSD, the public transport operator, to actually prioritize where to set the mobility hub first by looking at the most popular tram station for micromobility departure and arrival. One of the most popular was ETH University, which is a big engineering school actually in Zurich, very famous. So it helped us actually then prioritizing mobility hub in that specific location. We also help the city and WBZ improving the quality of service and diminishing the wait times. By looking at micromobility starts and arrival, we also help the tram network basically to be more the schedule to fit better basically with the needs and the demand of customers. For Brussels, we had them deploy 20 mobility hubs. So we actually started from the vehicle telemetry, created mobility insights, so where the most popular drop-off and pick-up areas, and then that basically helped us creating or having urban planning decisions about where to actually locate this mobility hub. An example is the following about Gare Bruxelles Mobility, Gare Bruxelles Midi, sorry, where you see a high concentration actually of drop-off and pick-up for micro-mobility vehicle, where it could be a good emplacement actually to set a mobility hub. Similarly to Gare Bruxelles Central. So here, starting really from the vehicle telemetries, creating the insights, and then triggering an urban planning decision, and then monitoring the use of this mobility hub. Brussels, again, planning and usage of cycling lane. Brussels created Corona lanes, and the goal was actually to figure out the usage of this Corona lane. Here's an example with Rue de la Loi, working with operator DOT and Lime, and seeing the difference between basically February 2020 to July, moving from 20 trips a day to 900 trips a day. That's generally like linked also to the summer, obviously, but that's also linked to that new urban planning decision that was made of creating these cycling lanes. As you can see here, basically it's using telemetry again from micro-mobility vehicles or data to make sure that we can map easily the number of trips per street section. Another example is Stockholm. So Stockholm, as many European cities, had an issue with cluttered sidewalks and streets, and how actually to better actually set the right policy, but as well as how to actually better in policies in terms of potentially no parking zone, but also mobility hub. And we actually did this study with them by looking at, for a couple of months, basically, the density, normalized density of parked vehicles on a per street section. So looking at basically like how cluttered for the width of the streets, the number of vehicles were parked on that streets. And we actually then prioritize specific areas where policies need to be changed and mobility hubs needs to be created. One of them, if you know, in Stockholm, one of them is Bjerggatan, sorry for my Swedish, that actually has a huge intensity actually of parked vehicles and could need basically new policies or hub parking infrastructure. The great thing also about data sharing is not only operators can share data to cities, but cities should share data with operators. And again, instead of like creating policy by email, by phone call or by whatever, use basically an editor, a GIS editor, where you can create a specific policy, a geography, and then that policy, through a policy API, again, supported by the MDS standard, can help conveniently, basically, and without ambiguity, shared policy to operators in a standardized way for everyone to have the same data in a the same policy and in a dynamic way. Whether you have like events, whether this is more permanent policy, we will encourage basically cities to share data also with operators in an easy way like this one. Mm-hmm. So an example is what could be done in Brussels with the no parking zone. Again, creating this parking regulation in the city, so no parking zone, and then helping basically the city of Brussels checking the compliance of operators. So again, you create the city policies, you check the compliance, and then you measure the compliance, and you provide live notification to operators about if the vehicles basically are being parked in the correct way or not. So this is again using the data to make sure that improving the parking compliance and also shortening the communication span between cities and operators when there is problem of parking. I think it was mentioned yesterday in the PPP talk about how do you actually, again, monitor and create the right policy, looking at KPIs. about whether or not you want to fix caps, how do you actually measure the quality of service? So everything can basically be audited. If the city wish to audit equity, then they can look at the fleet distribution, as you can see here, and maybe set distribution requirements if they wish basically to provide a minimum share of fleet on underserved area. How do you actually audit performance? You look at vehicle rotation. You wish to have a vehicle rotation that's above 1.5 per day. That's actually the right healthy amount of trips per day per vehicle that you want to wish to have in the city, and then you can adjust the caps accordingly. Similarly, the quality of service, fleet availability, you would want to wish to have a fleet availability above 90% to make sure, again, that the vehicles are in good order, so no vehicles basically are left for too long on the streets being broken. And last but not least, key takeaways from that presentation. So cities should enable data sharing with operators, privileging the MDS format for regulation and planning. This is much more in-depth than the GBS format that is more fit for travel information. Comply with GDPR, that means what? Starting with the purpose and then basically setting up data minimization and storage limitation, as well as system security. Engaging with the operators that could serve with the city mobility objectives. That means basically a request for proposal, that means potentially a tender, that means setting up a permit requirement, whatever you think is basically the most appropriate in your city, depending also on the size and on the range of type of vehicles that you want to also allocate in your city streets. And you could also use a micromobility management system like Vianova to make sure that you control and regulate and plan efficiently basically these new devices. Making sure that you have a cost-efficient system, leveraging basically experience from different cities about like developing new use cases and having a transparent system where you can understand how the data basically is coming out in and out. And last but not least, again, as I mentioned, is engaging in a virtuous circle of build, measure, and learn, of collaboration with collaborative relationship with operators. Build the right policies, build the right infrastructure, measure how well basically this infrastructure or policies are run, learn and audit from that, and then change the policy and infrastructure accordingly.
Excellent.
That was it. Thank you very much. Be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Thibault, for that very thorough presentation. I think there are a lot of questions that come to mind. I'm going to turn to the audience and ask you to briefly answer 2 points that were made, or 2 questions that were posed. The first is from Françoise Gaspard from the Île-de-France region in Paris, and she's asking you, Thibault, if you feel in your engagement with public authorities that they are in the driver's seat in these data sharing discussions. And the second point, now that relates to the public authorities, the second point by Sebastian Schlesbusch from DOT, he's asking, do you see a difference amongst different mobility operators in their willingness to share data with specific data formats? So are public authorities in the driver's seat in your experience? And do you see operators willing to share certain formats and not others?
Thank you. So on the first question, yeah, I do think city authorities are on the driver's seat. However, I do think that they still need support in making the right choices, for instance, in crafting the data agreement. We help a lot cities on crafting the right data agreement with operators, what to put inside. Also because we have the experience and know basically, we've seen challenges in different cities. So we know how basically to set this up a bit better and can share experiences also across cities. So I definitely think that they are in the driver's seat. Again, let's say that the more thorough is your policy and regulatory framework, the better you can also enforce the right data sharing requirement. You know? Mm-hmm. So it also comes to, and that was maybe a problem in certain countries in Europe, about having, let's say, of a loose regulatory framework for the regulation of shared micromobility, and that didn't really help at all to put the city authorities in the driver's seat, unfortunately. Okay. So then they have to be dependent on us or others, basically, that have specific data agreement with the operators. that's really making sure that they're on the driver's seat means making sure that they have the right regulatory framework.
Yeah.
Second of all, yes, I think there is some good differences between operators. First, in the
and by good, I'm assuming you mean bad differences.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not gonna give any names here, but generally, I see some operators being much more willing actually to work with city authorities, and I think city authorities are aware of that. That's clearly and that's why I would really encourage operators to work collaboratively with cities. So we see them in terms of their willingness to collaborate. We see that in terms of their willingness to share data, and we also see that in terms of the quality of the data that they're sharing.
Yeah.
And to some extent, some operators also have, some issues also with the data quality, which doesn't really help authorities to get the best data. But again, I think that's very positive. In terms of the landscape, things have improved a lot since our last conference in 2019.
Absolutely. And I think you're really right to, of course, you're in the trenches on this, but you're really right to point out the data quality issue because it is uneven. And so there's some questions of how do you set the right framework to ensure high quality data and validate that data. And the other point that you make, I just want to put a pin in, and we'll come back to it in the discussion, is what I view as one of the most interesting advances in terms of data syntaxes, and that's the policy API within MDS. And so my thinking is, how does that become generalizable, not just in MDS, but in any kind of approach to data sharing, that it becomes two-way data sharing, data to public authorities and policies from public authorities to operators. But a lot of questions, I see them coming in the chat. We're going to come back to some of these, but right now, Thibault, thank you very much for your presentation, fascinating and quite helpful. I'm going to Heidi Guenin from MobilityData onto the stage. Heidi Guenin is the Shared Mobility Product Manager for MobilityData. MobilityData is a nonprofit organization that helps build shared languages and tools by improving and extending data formats, making them easier to use through online platforms, documentation, software, and other digital tools. A big focus of MobilityData is on the implementation and growth of the General Bike Feed Specification, Gbfs, which is hard baked into MDS, among others. But Heidi also gets the prize for being the one that is most passionate about data at this session, because it is 2 o'clock in the morning from where she is, and she is willing to spend part of her evening to share MobilityData's experience in this domain. So thank you very much, Heidi, for being with us, and I look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Karen, for the opportunity to be able to share this information with you all. Yes, nice and early for me. So I'm Heidi Guenin. I'm with MobilityData, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I've got too many screens going on. I'm going to talk about the general Bikeshare feed specification. And so we're going to start with what it is and walk a little bit through kind of how we got here and why MobilityData is involved. One important thing about the general Bikeshare feed specification is you can see here that data describes real-time information about the state of shared mobility options. So this also includes bikes and scooters and cars and other vehicles, even though Bikeshare is in the title, and we'll kind of explain a little bit why that came to be. So the general Bikeshare feed specification started in the US in the 2010s. So in 2010, Bikeshare systems that were docked were emerging in cities across the United States. And the data was being produced, the data showing what was available was being produced in many, many different formats. And so if you were a software developer or a community researcher and you were trying to understand the state of the Bikeshare systems when they were docked, the format that you were working with was going to change from system to system. So in 2014, Mitch Vars, who was volunteering with the North American Bikeshare Association, and who was operating in Nice Ride in Minnesota here in the United States, started developing the general Bikeshare feed specification. And he did that. The reason that it has this name is that it was inspired by the general transit feed specification, which had been very successful in the previous years in standardizing transit data, particularly for rider information. By 2015, the NAPSA started endorsing and supporting and GBFS and hosting it on GitHub. But then in 2017, shared electric scooters and dockless bike share started operating in the US, and NAPSA did not have the technical capacity in their staff to continue to maintain the specification and make all the kinds of changes that were going to need to be made to keep up with the system, with what was happening on the ground. So that in 2019, NAPSA asked for some help. They put out a request for proposals, and they ended up choosing us at MobilityData to govern and improve GBFS. And this year, we released improvements that finally do a much more thorough job of supporting dockless and hybrid systems and multiple vehicle types, along with some other improvements that I'll talk about in a minute. So why did they choose MobilityData? Why did NAPSA choose us? So we started out as a project of the Rocky Mountain Institute GTFS Best Practices Group. This is a group of transit stakeholders who wanted to improve transit data. And it became clear that it had to kind of stand alone as a kind of group of folks who were neutral, working with the entire industry to try to keep the standard improving and responding to what's happening on the ground and what travelers and transit agencies need to see. So in April, we were incorporated as a nonprofit in Canada. We're based in Montreal, although I am in Portland, Oregon. I'm one of our US employees, and we have folks in Canada and France as well. We have 80 international members of our organization, and this includes a whole range of different kinds of actors in the mobility industry, lots of transit and shared mobility, obviously, and many government organizations. And we really work on areas that require industry consensus in order for the specifications to be really successful and broadly adopted. And we help enable that interoperability that is going to be needed for MaaS. A big piece of why MobilityData was also chosen to govern GBFS is our governance structure. So we borrowed a lot from the transit structure, and we moved that over to GBFS with some changes as well. And so you'll see here one of the big difference being that cities are a much bigger consumer of GBFS data for some of the reasons that have already been mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit more. Not as much on the transit side, but on the bike share side. And an important thing about our governance is that it's an open data standard. It's available for everyone to see and to use. And when we make changes to it, those changes are based on consensus, and they are including information from the stakeholders who create the data and the stakeholders who consume the data in trip planning applications. And so it makes sure that we're only including things that have this community consensus, which requires a little bit of work on all of our part to make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs. As Thibault was talking about with MDS being a much more comprehensive specification than GBFS, this is true. Same is true with NETEX. As NETEX is representing alternative modes, it's doing it from a much more comprehensive space. GBFS is really intended to be a more simple specification. It is not exhaustive. It doesn't include all your back-end operational data, things like that, the routes that the vehicles are taking. It keeps it lightweight and makes it data easy to consume and easy to use, but is often going to be needed to be used in conjunction with another specification. It's interoperable, so we work with lots of different specifications. We try to keep up to date with all of our friends and make sure that we're staying aligned and not making the data creation too onerous. It's adaptable to changes through that governance model that I mentioned, and it's open. We have a non-restrictive license on it so that folks can keep using that. You can see here that in this version 1 right here is, that version 1 was what MobilityData received from NAPSA to start the governance process. And as you kind of walk through down to version 3.0, you can see some of the changes that happened. And all of this work was done on GitHub with community conversations, through workshops with GBFS developers, through workshops with cities and operators. And we're really excited about the changes that we've been able to make in the last year. And are going to talk. I'll talk a little bit about what's coming in the next year. So what does GBFS do? So it provides that really basic information that travelers are going to want to see to get from A to B. So some of these screenshots are still using proprietary technology as I go through for the next couple minutes, because those dockless and hybrid system supports in GBFS are new and not everybody is producing them yet. So I just wanted to note that some of this is using GBFS and some of it's using a GBFS-like standard. So station locations, you're going to want to know where those are if you're trying to see if you have somewhere near you. The docks that are available and what kind of docks they are, that's available in GBFS. The vehicles that are available and what kind they are. Is it a bike? Is it a scooter? What propulsion type it has, if it's electric or electric assist, or if it's a combustion engine. The name of the vehicles, when operators have special names for the vehicles. And GBFS can now show that whether it's docked or whether it's free floating. We also show the charge or the distance that can be, this can be represented as the battery available or the level of travel distance. So it kind of depends on what the final application wants to show the user. And price. So right now, the price currently doesn't reflect what the price would be if you had a subscription service or a membership service. We have kind of a phased pricing improvement coming into the specification, and we know that that's something that is of interest to cities in particular, so that shared mobility options really do come across as competitive with driving and other options. And then the allowed travel details. And so this is if a rider where they can start and end a trip, what the speed limits are, things like that. This information being presented from the operator to the rider. So Thibault was talking about the policy API that takes that information from the city to the operators, and then this is the operator sharing that down to the riders. And there are kind of different reasons why all of that information might not be shared in the same way directly from cities to the riders. And then there are some other fields in the specification that, system alerts, calendars, things like that, that really kind of help riders know what's happening. And GBFS is starts this core component of MaaS that is trip discovery. So what is even available to you? And that's really the primary role that GBFS has been able to play with publicly published data, is just making data aggregators, trip planning functions able to show a rider all of their options in one place. So what's next for us? So we're going to continue enhancing GBFS. Vehicle types, geofencing are two of those places where we know there needs to be more work, and pricing as well. We just finished an industry survey, so we'll be publishing some of the analysis around that, where we were really looking at versioning and licensing and some of the different ways that people are starting to use GBFS now. We're going to be working on an authenticated GBFS, so I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. We have a repository of public GBFS data sets that we're strengthening. We're going to create more substantive GBFS license and version recommendations, and I think this is going to be particularly useful for cities who are starting to do that work of creating policy language around what GBFS they require. We're creating a validator so that anyone using GBFS knows the data they're getting actually is compliant. Resources and training library alongside that to make it easier to adopt. And this is all part of us making sure that, particularly in North America and Europe, which are the markets most using GBFS now, that we're creating all the tools that everybody needs to feel really confident about the specification. And we have workshops for our members that really get into these in more detail. We continue to coordinate. We coordinate with MDS. We coordinate with CurbLR. We're coordinating with NetEx, and so we're constantly making sure that we know what's going on, and we're all trying to keep things as easy as possible for those doing this work. And really briefly, the authentication. So I think from cities in particular, we heard this from our European members when we decided that the public-facing data should not have a stable ID for a vehicle any longer because it created privacy concerns. We know we broke some of the use cases that cities were using GBFS for, and that researchers were using it for, and advocates were using it for. And we promised we would come back and figure out what to do about that. So that's part of the work we're doing this year. We're going to have the same problem. The more information you provide about a vehicle in a public data set, the easier it is to track that vehicle through time, which is something that we don't want publicly used data to contribute to. And then there's data that cities want, but that creates some competitive concerns for operators. And this is a question that we're going to be bringing to the community. And the last thing is this publicly available data set we have almost 500 publicly available GBFS data sets now being produced in over 38 countries. And at this point, we are cleaning all of that up. We're making it more easily digestible for the folks who are using that information in trip planning applications and aggregators. And that's going to be something that's, I think, will be of interest to cities, and particularly for this planning and regulation and being able to compare across different parts of the globe. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Philippe.
Thank you, Heidi, for that very comprehensive presentation of what is, I believe, one of the key building blocks of what a mobility as a service ecosystem needs. And that's this consistent format for both discovering what's available, but also describing what's happening in the system. I guess I've got, there are a few points in discussion that are coming up. But I'd like to ask an overarching question that goes specifically to one point that you made, and that's on the differential willingness of certain operators to share cost or fare data or cost or price data. And you've noted that that is a difficulty because there's resistance to standardizing that approach on two levels. One, because they want to own the customer relationship, but also because they are always innovating in this domain. And so some of those innovations might not be in conformity with the current specification of GBFS. Can you talk a little bit about that and say, and if you have any, identify some of the policy both insights or recommendations that you would have on dealing with how to share cost or price data? I don't know if you saw yesterday, the city of Leuven has its own layer that handles that. So they have a separate layer to handle cost and price data. I don't know. What are you seeing out in the field?
So when we started this process of kind of creating, so when we inherited GBFS to manage it, price was basically a text field. And so not machine readable in any useful way for trip planning applications. And several things we heard from operators about this theme. One was that they do A/B pricing. They test different prices on a single individual. They test different prices across different individuals. And making that apparent is not something that they were interested in doing. So this brings a different question to cities, where I think it's up to cities to ask whether it's important to them that there is transparency into that. And I think, we've seen kind of here in the United States, the regulations, the taxi industry in particular, and how the taxi industry has just been forced to simplify their pricing because they've had to present it in a certain way. Mm-hmm. So for cities, I think there's a question of what is the level of responsibility on the city to require more transparent pricing. And that's something that cities kind of have to work with their operators on. One thing we heard from operators is that they are sometimes asked by the cities to produce pricing information, and it creates a competitive disadvantage for them if the city is also not requiring it of other operators and enforcing it evenly across the board. Mm-hmm. And so this is the reason why operators were willing to have this conversation with us, because they would rather everyone be required to present it the same way than be put at a competitive disadvantage. But it does require cities across the board to consistently require the information and consistently enforce it. There's a big difference. GBFS is embedded in MDS. It is required for compliant MDS to have a public-facing GBFS feed. This has not been typically enforced. And so I think that enforcement, which has already come up today, I think is a really big part of the question. And the last thing I'll say is, one of the concerns with pricing right now is that we don't represent memberships, we don't represent subscriptions. And so that trip may look more expensive. Right now, pricing is really useful if you're a first-time user, you're trying to understand the trip, not if you are a daily bike share user. If you're a daily bike share user, that price is going to appear higher than it really is for you. And there's a question, we decided to focus on that the new trip, because we think most daily bike share users already have a sense of what that's costing them. But there is a concern about it looking less competitive than driving if your scooter or your bike trip looks like it's going to be $10 when really it's going to be $2.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing going forward. So we'll come back to some of those issues in the discussion. Another takeaway from a city perspective that I get from this is you have to have staff that is GitHub savvy and that is code savvy, because a lot of what matters, as Heidi has just gone into, is happening on GitHub. And when it comes to data specifications and data sharing and some of the mechanics. So it's worth making sure that when you hire people that they do know about these outcomes. We'll come back to those in a bit. Thank you, Heidi, for that presentation. And I'm going to ask Tim Wiegels from FreeNow to come on stage. Tim is the head of data at FreeNow, formerly MyTaxi. Many of you may have known it as that. FreeNow is one of the leading mobility providers in Europe and is part of a suite of new mobility services housed under a joint partnership between BMW and Daimler. FreeNow has released its own data manifesto that I'm sure Tim will address in his presentation. Welcome on stage, Tim, and I look forward to the presentation you'll make in 8 minutes.
No pressure.
And we'll have a few follow-up questions afterwards.
Yeah. At first, thanks for having me. Let me also share my screen. I hope I find the right one immediately. Yes, that looks good. So, hello. And as already said, I'm coming from the more private economy side in this whole thing. And as you've seen in several talks today already, there's a lot of stuff that's going on. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be shared. And this is pretty much from our side telling you what we think needs to be done and how this should be done. So just very quickly going through it, it was already said, we are, so we were acquired by Daimler in 2014. And as you see on this long arrow of time, a lot of stuff happened. So in the beginning, we were a small provider that was mainly operating in Germany and in Hamburg, where I'm sitting right now. But then after the Daimler acquisition, we were actually founded in 2009. We also acquired Halo, who's an UK provider and was mainly operating in the UK, Spain, and Portugal. Then we also acquired Beat, who's operating in Greece and in Latin America. Clever Taxi operating in Romania. Captain operating in the UK, in France, and in Portugal. We also kicked off our own path to multimodality. We're starting Hive scooters, which some of you might know. And then in 2019, things changed again a little bit with BMW coming in and us changing from MyTaxi to FreeNow. The most important thing actually happened this year because we are actively trying to become one app, one team, and one brand. So not having these 4 different apps side by side. And this also means we are getting quite big. So we are actually working in 15 countries with more than 150 cities, which means data sharing with cities is quite important and needs to be very streamlined for us. We're also the #1 provider, #2 provider in most of our cities and do 300 million tours a year. And even more importantly, we are going very, very much into the area that we are on a mission to empower smarter mobility decisions. So we really want to help people to move freely and cities to thrive, which from my point of view, being the VP data, also means share data with cities, get cities the most important information, but also only the information they need, so don't overload them. And mobility as a service is one big thing for us. So recently, we also started scooters in our app. We now have car sharing, we have mopeds, we have electric bikes, which means the data to be shared is getting more and more and more and more, and it's actually getting quite hard to understand what we do need to share. And this is where, well, our mission statement, again, that's a slightly different mission statement comes from. We need to engage with everyone. So even being private economy, and obviously in our best case, we would like to work and try to do as little stuff with the outside as possible to not be, taken away from our work to improve the app. But the thing is, we really have to do this. At first, because our data can really help shape everyone. I mean, if you see that we have information about ride-hailing, about bikes, about everything, we have all the routes, so we can actually also say, these are routes that are not taken that often with bikes. Maybe the bike lanes need to improve. These are routes that are taken very often with car sharing and ride-hailing. Maybe the streets have to be improved more often than other streets. And this is also something that governments are seeing, because they really see that the data we have is a big competitive advantage and can massively help in all the decision-making. For us, however, there's a lot of requests, a lot of needs, there's a lot of stuff we can do. We decided, from our point of view, the data sharing should not be mandatory. So there should be something where we really have a clear use case. And why this is, so this might seem a little bit presumptuous, just saying it coming from me, but there are reasons for this, which I will tell you later as well. It also must be flexible and very interactive and collaborative. I can tell you already from working inside a company, if we don't know exactly what is needed, then we will never get to the right, to the right point and the right result in the end. And it also must balance the benefits of sharing with the privacy of customers. GDPR is a very big topic for us, internally, but also externally, and there are even more problems we see in there. So this is our principles of data sharing we did in our data sharing manifesto. The first thing for us is how to share. At first, it should not be mandatory, which is due to several reasons. It creates significant issues in terms of balancing privacy and data management. There's a lot of stuff like, for example, real-time data. I come to real-time data later, but real-time data, as soon as you have this, is very easy to track back to the customer and then actually understand who the customer is, and then real-time data becomes GDPR problematic again. Also, there's a lot of stuff which obviously from our point of view needs to ensure competitiveness, because most of the data we share, and if you have a data team like me, I have 70 people, a lot of data scientists, as soon as you enrich this data you get with other data, you could get very clear insights into company's business model, which then would undermine the competitiveness. And if you look at the landscape, there are several scooter providers, there are several ride-hailing providers. We all want to work together, but there are still some things we have to, I don't want to say keep hidden, but more secret to ensure our competitiveness, because otherwise we might go in the direction that we have one monopolistic provider again, which I don't think anyone wants in the end. Which is why we think, and it's something we are actively pushing, all data sharing should go via escrow services. So the idea here would be similar to DMPs or data marketplaces, which most of you might know from digital marketing or anything else, where a data exchange is used to actually have consented usage for both sides who uses data. What you can actually see here on the, can I get a pointer? Yes, on the right side. So for example, if one provider shares it, there should be this thing which then has a contract how to share the data, which obviously for authorities and regulators will be much easier, but there also needs to be sharing with everyone else and also smaller companies. When and what to share, from our point of view, because there's a lot of data. So just very anecdotal, if I look at the locations of our cars, we get millions of informations every minute. And this means this is something that really needs to be aggregated. It really needs to be made actionable, because just getting bulks of data will not help everyone. From our point of view, there should be aggregations which are available for everyone. So if, for example, the user behavior on a weekly basis, important hotspots per cities, because most of the decisions that need to be taken on authorities are more in a long-term direction. So we should cater what is needed. I also have this, my favorite topic. When I started working more with regulators and politicians, I always heard people need real-time data, which from my point of view, which I will also show you on the next slide or 2 slides later, is very unfeasible, because there's massive amount of data which just cannot be used by cities. For MaaS platforms, we actually just need high responsive APIs. So the platforms don't need to know at all times where all the cars are. They need to have a nice API which gives them the information when a car is actually available in the surrounding of the person that looks at this area. Use cases. We shouldn't do sharing for the sake of it. There should always be a clear use case, which we already saw in the previous presentations. And to be honest, looking more into this makes me quite happy that there are more things going in the direction of really, we have a use case, we need it for this. And there also needs to be very, very close interaction with external stakeholders and us to really get to the right position. And one of my, I don't want to say pet peeves, it's more a fear topic quite often, is the GDPR point, because there's a lot of stuff where if you have the right information for the data, it's really quite hard to make this GDPR bulletproof. And obviously, FreeNow operates in the whole of Europe and also Latin America. So if you look at this, we are actually currently in 150 cities. We would like to serve all the cities. We would really like to share the data in the right way with everyone, what is needed. But for this, we really need standards. Without these standards, from our point of view, it's just not doable. Even with a team of 500 people, we won't be able to service everyone. And I have this example on the side. For example, we are currently looking at the national level that there might be an aggregation for public transport information, ticketing and everything else on the German level. This also needs to go into the European level. Otherwise, we will always have to do much, much more stuff. And this will always also create very high entry-level barriers for new companies. So the uniform standards and interface are essential, because if they're not available, we should just look what is there. That needs to be easy, because the effort will always be high. Just a very easy example, also an anecdote I can tell you. The same goes for marketing, for example. In marketing, you could start to get marketing costs to actually implement APIs of all different marketing partners. But there are already companies that do this for you, which from my point of view saves me at least 20 people that are working on this constantly. Which means, yeah, low entry barriers will really ensure equal opportunities, because not only companies like us that have up to 100 people working in data should be able to do this, but also smaller companies that maybe have 2 people that just needs to grab stuff and work with it very, very quickly. And there are already suitable models from other countries. We saw the bike example. There's MDS. So this is really something that authorities should take. And again, from our point of view, this is more a plea than a principle. This should be standardized at least at European level, so we can really work with it. And I think I speak for all the private companies here, like Dot, like Tier, like Lime, like Bolt, everyone. We are available in most European cities, and we want to service this properly. So this should be on European level. Also, something that from my point of view is working quite well right now, there needs to be a balance of mutual benefit between the public sector and private companies. FreeNow is part of the German Data Space for Mobility initiative, and there we are really working very closely with the public sector to understand what is needed from both sides to not just regulate everything, but actually make this positive and beneficial for all sides. And the last one is, I talked quite often about why not real-time data? Why is data hard to work on? Why do we need a lot of work on this? I just want to show you what we actually do. So very quickly, what is our data stack looking like? At first, we ingest data quite often from our apps, which is something that is quite expensive. So for example, every 24 hours, we get the information from our application, from external data, which is cleansed, validated, and transformed, which needs to be put into a data governance framework. Otherwise, the data quality will always be, let me put it bluntly, very, very crappy. So this is something we have to do. And then this is put into long-term storage. At the same time, there's a lot of streaming data, which comes in real time, which we then actually already use a real-time platform for, because even we with 70 people can't stem this on our own, which is doing the streaming, which using Apache Kafka to get also the data in there. And is then also used for our various real-time applications, which in this case also would be an API getting the MaaS information, which also goes into the long-term storage. Then there's 10 years of data you can use in an SQL engine, and you have reporting tools. And in the end, the reporting tools is what most cities need, but there's a whole bunch of stuff before that, which for me is important to say, nothing is trivial or free. So even if we do data sharing, the data is not free. The data on our side really involves a lot of massive work and money going into this. And we really have to match the expectation in the reality. There's a lot of hype of data science analytics. That's not only in the cities, that's not in the public sector, that's everywhere, but there's huge gaps of understanding what we can actually do with data, how much work is involved to actually make the data qualitatively useful, and what the tools are. And also, that's something I think everyone who is working with data knows, it's a critical skill, and the critical skill just is not there. So for example, I started working in this 15 years ago. It wasn't called data. No one really knew what's happening, and with all the automation, everything that's going on, there will be more going into this, and more people need it, and right now there's a big shortage. So even if we do this, we have to work very closely together to use the people that are there in the best way possible to get everyone on the right track. And that's it.
All right.
Thank you.
Tim, I've got to say thank you for showing us how the sausage is made. And it's clear for people who work on this that there is a lot of effort and, as you say, resources that go into ingesting, processing, cleaning, and then validating data for use. And so thank you again for sharing that. I have one question, though, that is being picked up as well in the chat, and that is that the first plank of your manifesto is that no data sharing should be mandatory. And yet, there are many instances in other sectors, health, taxes, etc., where entities have to share data in order to achieve public outcomes. Helmut Augustin from Vienna is pointing out that mandatory data sharing for some parts of the data, creates a level playing field. And it also helps city authorities address the two functions that they have, which is planning and strategic investment and managing outcomes, so safety, equity, etc., and then enforcement. And I think that one of the things that we maybe forget, but I don't think you forget, because you pointed it out, is that in fact for those functions that public authorities have, real-time data is only necessary for very, very specific regulated outcomes, and that's parking, that's speed regulations that are being surpassed. So maybe what we need is not so much an understanding of no data sharing, but understanding when the most obtrusive data sharing should be used as a last resort to carry out government functions.
So from my point of view, I maybe data sharing not mandatory is not cutting it completely. Only mandatory with clear use cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
And still going into data minimization and going into as much privacy as possible.
And we don't have that right now. And that's one
exactly.
thing where it's really helpful to have the private sector like yourselves provide part of that discussion and to be engaged in that discussion with cities. We don't really have that roadmap yet of what are the use cases, and for these different use cases, what then should public authorities be asking for, in what framework, in what format, with what kind of retention rules and processing rules and destruction rules as well for data destruction. So thank you for that. We'll come back to some of these points later. Thank you again for presenting that very comprehensive view. I'm going to ask our final speaker to come on stage. Our final speaker, typically we say we save the best for the last. Every speaker has been excellent, and so I'm going to welcome another excellent speaker on stage. That is Diego Canales from Populus. Diego is the Global Partnerships Manager at Populus. Populus is a data platform for private mobility operators and cities to deliver safe, equitable, and efficient streets. Now, Diego oversees Populus's partnerships with cities and operators outside of the US and Canada. Key in this work is enabling data sharing frameworks that deliver what cities require while preserving individual privacy. I noted in Tim's presentation that there was a direct call for groups such as Populus, such as Vianova, to be present. So I'm sure that Diego will be happy to have heard that. But Diego, I turn the floor over to you for your 8-minute presentation, and then we'll have a few follow-up questions and convene for a broader discussion if we have time. Thank you.
Thanks, Philippe, and thanks Karen and Paul's team for inviting me to speak today. Sharing my presentation. So I'll cover several topics, and sorry about the length of the title of my session. As Philippe said, I'm Diego Canales. I'm the Global Partnerships Manager at Populus. Today, the topics I'd like to address are three main topics. The first one is how cities are using the data from bikes and scooters to plan and manage infrastructure, so some of the use cases. Also, delving a little bit into how potential expanding use of data sharing, specifically of ride-hailing, ride-sharing, and freight operators to help cities. Basically, the experimentation of the curb regulations, which I know there's a lot of competing uses, and how can this be used to validate and ultimately build the case for large-scale changes. And ultimately, I'm going to show a little bit of the different models that we've seen that have popped up used by cities for the sharing of the data. So really quick about Populus. So just like Vianova, we're a data platform that helps cities use data and share data with between the public sector and mobility operators. We secure data from about 20 mobility operators in about 80 cities, meaning the US, Canada, but also in some parts of Europe and Latin America and Middle East.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but have you shared your screen?
I suppose, sorry.
So, because as much as we want to see speaking, we're not going to see the slides that you've prepared.
Doing it now. Yeah, sorry about that.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So jumping back. So so as I was saying, we in about 20 mobility operators, 80 cities. Since 2018, we have overseen about 85,000 scooters and more than 50 million trips, which is quite a big number of trips. We are supportive of data standards, data specifications. I think those are very important and crucial for the public sector being able to get data from and share data from mobility operators. So we work with Gbfs, MDS, We have also experience with GTFS, now CurbLR, which is an emerging data standard for the curb. And ultimately, we help cities basically efficiently access and get that data turned into actionable insights, right? Whether it's for regulatory or for planning purposes. I want to jump a little bit into what's happening in the cities, right? So this is what a picture that shows the traditional use of the curb. So this is San Francisco, the curb and the street space allocations. We can see that about 90% of the space is used for vehicle storage, where only 10% of this space is actually priced. The rest is 5% for movement of people, 2% for movement of goods, and 2% for public space, a little bit for emergency vehicles. However, the curb is changing a lot, no? And there's a lot of new uses competing for it. So whether it's vehicles for, charging vehicles, for electric vehicles, whether it's ride-hailing, ride-sharing, taxi-hailing, a lot of micromobility is coming into the streets in the curb space, whether scooters, dog bike-sharing systems, a lot of new transit vehicles, different sizes, priority lanes, and movement of goods. We see a lot of like last mile deliveries now happening, specifically now due to the pandemic and the COVID. We see a lot of pressure from the use of the curb space from different freight vehicles and ultimately public space. We also seen a lot of initiatives from cities about expanding sidewalks, slow streets, closing streets for the people use. And we've seen that there's three main segments, if you want to call it, that have been driving this change in the curb. And one is ride-hailing, the other is micromobility, and last mile delivery. And the challenge, but also the opportunity of these three segments, they use connected shared fleets. So there's an opportunity to harvest data and being able to get data shared with cities. And this is something we've seen on micromobility, but there's a potential for using data from ride-hailing and also from freight deliveries. So I want to jump a little bit into the use case of what we're seeing. And actually, I think this grabs a little bit what Thibault from Vianova had said, and also Heidi, about how the cities are managing the public space, but then also communicating that to the applications, to the mobility operators, who then pass that information to their riders. So here is a case of Tel Aviv, who they have dedicated 500 scooter parking spaces in order to manage the parking. They have a fleet of about almost 10,000 vehicles, 10,000 scooters. And so they want to manage the public space very well. So they have digitized and they have put spaces, who then communicate that information to the policy API, to the operators, who then depict which are the parking zones for the users. And the way the mobility applications show this to their users, it's basically using the Gbfs or a like format within their apps and so on. This also allows measuring performance over time. So here it's a graph of what we've seen for Tel Aviv parking corrals, the performance. Basically, we've seen that from May to November, the performance has increased. So we know that the GPS accuracy is, there's always errors. So that's why, for example, the blue line, it takes into account only the scooters parked inside the corral, but then the red and the yellow line takes into account 5 meters or 10 meter radiuses, accounting for those GPS errors. So we've seen that about 80% of the scooters right now are parked either inside a scooter corral or within 10 meters of the corral, which I think it's very helpful for being able, the city, to manage the parking, as we have said, that's a use case around the sharing of the data. Also, infrastructure planning. In this case, Tel Aviv has a goal to double the amount of kilometers for bike paths by 2025, I think from 140 kilometers to go to 300 kilometers. And they're using this data not only to plan for where the bike path locations are or could be, but also the capacity, right? So this is based on trip volumes, and we can see that there's some routes, some streets taken by scooters, which have almost 1,200 trips per day, which is a lot of trips to be, used by a single street. They begin mimicking what would be like a cycle highway. And so that is very useful information, not only for planning the locations, but the capacity. So what type of cycle bike lane I should put in place. And then delving a little bit more into the case of ride-hailing and freight, a lot of cities were starting to test changes to the curb. They were doing what we call curbside management pilots, like PUDOs, pickup drop-off zones for ride-hailing in very dense areas of the city. Washington was doing one here. This is where I'm based in Washington, D.C. They're doing one in a very dense area where at night it was very cluttered, the use of the curb. So we're experimenting with that. We know that due to COVID right now, a lot of these ride-hailing pilots and the use of the curb have been momentarily stopped. However, loading zones for freight is actually a use case that is very strong, even more so now that there's a lot of more deliveries. And so cities are wanting to experiment. And we have dealt a little bit, I'm going to show a little bit of what we've been doing in that space for the case of car sharing. So for car sharing, this is the city of Seattle, who actually had a very nice layer of the cost of the pricing of the curb. And in purple, the lines in purple actually are residential streets, which are not priced. However, the green ones, which is more in downtown, they have price, and the price according to the day of the week and also the time of the day. And we've been using that data along with the GPS from the car sharing companies to validate the use of parking and creating invoices. So that's something we've done for Seattle and also for Oakland, where Oakland, the use case is similar. However, the data layer was different. In this case, there was no block phase for the pricing of the curb. It was more based on park meters. So the green dots you see all joined together actually are park meters. And so the pricing is much more uniform, which is the same price throughout the day. And so based on that, we have been able to measure also how much parking they've been used, the free-floating car sharing systems in the city. And now jumping to the last topic I wanted to delve in is basically the 3 typical models that we have seen for mobility data sharing across cities. So the first model on the left side, it's the aggregated or data that's reported by the mobility operator. In the examples here, we see that many European cities are receiving dashboards from video operators, which is basically an aggregation of the data, and they pass it on as a Tableau or a dashboard that the operator has built in-house. Also, a lot of ride-hailing services share data this way. One example was Uber Movement dashboard, which is shared with cities. And the pros here is that the reporting burden is placed in the operator. There's really no risk in terms of like risk assessment of these 3 models from the city. So this is like the least risky example. Then data delivered, which we fall into that category as well as Vianova, it's data delivered through a trusted third party. So examples, as I said, Populus. The process that the data is audited through a trusted third party. So we have access to the data and we use a standard. That's what we all hope for, using a data standard to make this auditing easier. There's also very little risk from the city perspective because they only have access to the aggregate data insights. I guess something to note is the aggregation that we do is we do it for all the operators that we receive data from, and also that we use methodologies for aggregation that help solve the questions that the cities have. Where sometimes where the aggregation is done by the operator, the aggregation is done based on whatever methodology they use. And so if you receive dashboards from 5, 6 mobility operators, the aggregations will be different throughout all those dashboards and all those mobility operators. So this, I would say, it's also cost-effective for advanced analytics. And then the last model, which is basically where cities receive the data themselves, the raw data, this aggregate data. Examples, well, the first one, Los Angeles DOT, which actually they began the development of the MDS specification. And this is where also big cities tend to be able to have the infrastructure, the governance, the data scientists to be able to get this data. And the process is flexible. There's direct data, access to raw data, so they can experiment with new things. And cities can increase their capacity and technical capacity and so on. So with that, I'm finishing my presentation and discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Diego, for staying on time. We have reached the end of our session, but I've been speaking with our organizers. There is no session immediately right after this, so we're going to extend this session by about 10 minutes because I'd like to help have the panelists address a few questions that have come up and that I have for them as well. So I'm asking all the panelists to come back on stage. I see Diego, I see Aman, Tim, if Heidi and Thibault can come on stage. So as I said, we'll be extending the question and answer for about 10 minutes. I'd like to ask a question that goes directly to what cities need or maybe thinking about. And that is that in Europe at least, cities help guide mobility outcomes have sustainable urban mobility plans. Now, data governance rarely features in plans, and cities, if they have a data governance framework, is rarely connected to their SUMP or their mobility plan. So the question I have for the panel is, what might a city mobility data governance plan look like, and what basic elements should it include from your perspective? This is speaking directly to the cities who are struggling with this idea of, well, then what is the guidance that we should have in place to help grow our ability to govern this emerging data ecosystem? Diego, I'll turn to you first, and then others, please come in as you want to.
Philippe, I was having trouble understanding you. Could you just really quick repeat?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, there's a little bit of echo, but yes, I'll.
Okay, hopefully I'll speak. So cities typically put in place in Europe sustainable urban mobility plans. These rarely have a data governance part. So my question to you is, giving advice to cities that are in this virtual room, what would you tell them might be the basic framework for a city mobility data governance plan that can be integrated into their SUMP or stand as a standalone function? What are the basic elements you feel have to be there?
Yeah, thanks, Philippe. I think I've seen, I know the SUMP, as they call it in Europe, and I think the use cases, that delineation of use cases is very important. What specific policy, regulatory task or planning tasks you want to put in. So I think a clear division also on the type of tasks, because that also helps align with the data standards and the type of latency you want in the data. For example, that's where we were discussing the real time, which is very specific task, which is more parking or speed, for example. But the other ones are planning, which you don't require real-time data. You require. So I think the putting the task that you will be using and the use case is very important. And then, as Thibault said, I think cities have to take, be on the driver's seat in terms of like taking charge and saying, if I'm going to do it mandatory, I have to put in place address my regulatory needs and say, yes, I'm going to be a data controller, understand what the responsibilities of that for being able to get the data. Sometimes they want the data, but they're a little bit shy. They shy away from being the data controller, which under GDPR, that's what makes you responsible for the use of the data, and that you're aware that there's implications to that. So I think that's important to note.
Are there other insights on what a city should be thinking about in a data governance plan? Tim?
I can give another anecdote. Yeah, from our point of view, it should also be very clear how the data infrastructure looks like, because the quality needs to be ensured. It needs to be very, very open and trackable where the data is flowing to and where it's coming from, and to be made sure that it's not going to the outside, besides the city or besides the people that actually use it.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the data controller direction. You just said.
Yeah, I have a few pointers. One, I think there needs to be an overarching data strategy that cuts across various different departments. Oftentimes, they would just focus on the transportation data separately and health data separately. And oftentimes, when you think about data across all of these different sectors and departments, the value that you can realize is going to be much larger compared to a sectoral approach. So thinking about how data from various different sectors can be combined to essentially realize the public value, which would often be left on the table if you take a very siloed approach, is one idea. The second thing, again, building on what was said earlier, is the need for capacity within city government departments to be able to kind of analyze, process, and use the data. It's not the data that's valuable, it's the insight that comes from that data that's valuable. So again, thinking about capacity. And the last point that I would talk about is the need to start attempting to value the indirect value that can be generated from data, which is very fundamental in essentially thinking about the incentives or taxes or subsidies that are needed to overcome the barrier that Tim talked about in terms of the need for resources to essentially be able to collect data, to be able to process data and improve the quality. So again, just thinking about what type of money or other types of incentives might be available on the table is helpful.
Mm-hmm. Thibault, Heidi, do you have any input on what a data city governance plan should look like? No?
Go ahead.
No? Okay.
Yeah, I'm
All
not
right.
sure about anything. Like I do think that this question of one of the things that, in terms of city staff being savvy when you're making these agreements, is thinking about the licensing. I think is a really big issue, and it's something that we've noticed that it's newer, that there's a lot of data out there that's unlicensed. There's a lot of projects that are unlicensed, and we're a new enough industry that we haven't run into a ton of problems with it yet, but they're coming. So I think that that's something that's going to be important for cities to wrap their heads around.
All right. I see in the sidebar there has been an ongoing chat on a number of data standards that are out there, some that we've talked about, GBFS, GTFS, MDS, NATEX, et cetera. Some that we haven't talked about, TOMP API or TOMP City, that's under development by the City of Amsterdam. What's your view going forward to the panel? Are we going to see a multiplicity of different data standards that will make companies like Thibault's and Diego's quite happy going forward to be the one that helps capture that value? Will we see some kind of convergence around some functional bins, if you will, specifications, or on the overall architecture, but not on the detailed standard of data? Or do you see us converging towards one data standard that relates to mobility, keeping in mind Aman's point that this has to fit into a broader specification around how data is shared? Thibault, what do you think? Where are we heading?
Well, I think having data standards would help everyone. This would help basically like software vendor, this would help mobility operator, this would help cities, this would help everyone, because I don't think there is any value in people building API connector for each operator or for each city or for each connection. This is not where you want to spend your time. This is not where you want to spend your money. So data standards, I think, would help everyone. And I would think that, I obviously, like everyone knows that I push a lot for the MDS standard. For one reason is that I see that this is actually the standard that's being used in the industry. And I like that bottom-up approach about how basically the industry can create itself, can create a standard that is basically being collaborative and adding more and more use cases and having people from different markets, Europe, the US, operators, software providers, cities, basically contributing to this new standard. And again, I think as Heidi was saying, I think you have different standards for different mean. GBFS, I always say that this is the standard by default for any mobility as a service applications. MaaS is the standard by default. MDS is the standard by default for regulation and planning. So one needs to have both, and this is why, as part of the MDS compliance, GBFS is included, and for good reasons.
Yeah, I would just add to that I do think I think it's unrealistic to think that we are going to get to one standard that rules all the standards. And I think the interoperable nature of the standard and keeping them open and keeping a governance structure, as Thibault just mentioned, we, like GBFS also it was built by the industry, it continues. And by industry, I don't just mean the private operators, right? It's really the entire industry of stakeholders. And I think my hope with that would be that as these specifications become more and more standard, that the standards that win out are the ones that have a lot of transparency around how they're governed, that have a lot of that input to make sure they're implementable and they're being maintained. I would hope that we don't get stuck in proprietary pay to play kind of standards, but I do anticipate that we'll continue to have many standards, and the open source community is used to working together and trying to maintain our swim lanes. And so I think it'll be okay.
You're muted, Philippe.
It's not a video conference if you don't end up muted at some point when you're talking. So go. I see Diego, you wanted to make a point, and I'd like to ask you and maybe some others to address, well, in this world of multiple standards, what do cities have to take out of this? What can cities do now? Because they have competing standards, and they may not have the technical ability to have people on staff that can manage the flow between all of these. And I think this is why we've seen Vianova, Populuses of this world create value. So Diego, and I don't know who hasn't, Aman and Tim, on this question of where are we heading in terms of standards?
Yeah. So, ourselves, we're a little bit data agnostic. Obviously, we like MDS because the more adoption, it makes life easier. But we understand the reality is that there will be a couple standards out there. And GTFS is a good example where European transit agencies still have specific standards, and TfL has a standard. But there's a way to change GTFS or something that TfL has into GTFS. So the interoperability is actually crucial to be able to talk between standards. And I also think the question is, we're talking about MDS is very focused right now on micromobility. And so what happens with, there's a lot of other modes. I talk bike hailing, there's car sharing. Car sharing, it's getting MDS being used by car sharing, but what about last mile deliveries? And we have cities wanting to regulate that. Will MDS be a fit for all type of mode? I'm not sure. It will be a very monstrous kind of standard. So we will also need something for, will it be specific mode? I'm not sure, probably. Ride hailing, I know there's a working group on MDS, OMF, about whether ride hailing could use MDS. I don't know, yet to be seen, or whether it's another data standard that emerges. But I think the interoperability with these standards is important, and that they're open data standards that we don't have to pay for the use of them. It's also crucial.
Yeah, thank you, Diego. Just for those who don't know, the OMF, the Open Mobility Foundation, is the body that curates the mobility data specification and is led by cities in mainly North America. Tim or Aman, any closing words on this question?
Yeah. So I think when we think about standards, the XKCD cartoon immediately comes to mind. There are 10 industry standards right now. So what do we want to do? Let's create the 11th one that everyone adopts. And now you have 11 instead of 10 standards. So it's really hard to say which way the industry is going to evolve, whether we will see, a few standards emerge as the winners. But, I would just kind of call on the role of policymaking here to essentially ensure that we have more of a harmonized approach, as Thibault was saying. It doesn't work in anyone's benefit if we have several different standards for the same type of process. So, the more we can get different players in industry as well as governments at the national, international level, especially here in Europe, to collaborate towards some sort of a harmonized approach, the better it is going to be for the industry to move forward.
Excellent. Tim?
Yeah, from my point of view, for sure, there will be different standards in the beginning because it just doesn't work in another way. But if you look at VHS or Betamax, at some point, one of them will be used more and will just go in the right direction. So I think from our point of view, the next few years will be slightly painful because we will have to service more than one, but in the long term, this will go in the right direction. It has to be.
Excellent. We've passed our limit of time for this session. If anything, that proves that as I opened the session, I talked about the usefulness of studying boring things. Data is not boring. It's essential, and as we've discussed in the session, it's essential to help cities carry out the mandates that they have and the objectives they want to achieve. And I think my overall takeaway from the session is that, yes, we have to be ready. Cities have to be ready for a world where there will be multiple languages that will be spoken. The main thing for cities is to be clear on the questions that they want answered. and to be able to assess in what way different standards may be able to help them answer those questions. And part of that will require investing in upskilling staff to be able to at least understand these issues, if not solve them. If they can't solve them or can't address them in their full technical complexity, I'm sure that there are the Diegos and Thibauts of this world that are ready to help with that task. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Diego, Aman, Thibault, Tim, Heidi. I'd like to thank the person that you have not seen, but she's been in the background, Laura, who's been helping run this session. And of course, thanks to Polis and to Karen van Kloysen for curating this session and bringing all these viewpoints together. Thank you as well, audience, for staying with us as you eat lunch on this day. Good day, and we look forward to seeing you for Rio in person at next year's POLIS Conference.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.